Thank you for joining us for today's panel discussion, and thank you to the team at Research America for inviting me and this incredible group of guests. I'm really pleased to be moderating this discussion on a topic that's also a critical focus for us at Health Affairs. We're very much aware that there are gatekeeper institutions all along the health research pathway, including journals like ours, that affect who has the opportunity to conceive of, carry out, and publish research, and stepping back, even who has the opportunity to become a health researcher in the first place. So at the journal, we're pursuing a multi-pronged effort to improve DEI within our pages and in health services and health policy scholarly publishing more broadly. So our efforts are targeted at first increasing the diversity of the authors and the peer reviewers of the research we publish. Second, publishing more health equity research from institutions or community-based organizations that historically have not been well represented in health affairs. And importantly, third, we're internally addressing our own biases as part of the publishing enterprise. As I'm sure we'll discuss today, DEI work isn't easy and it's not a short-term commitment. Our panel today represents different facets of the health research enterprise, and I'm looking forward to hearing their insights about how they define DEI and how they track progress and measure success, including the challenges they've faced in doing so. So let's go ahead and jump into it. I'm going to start us off with a handful of questions to get the conversation started, but I know there's a lot of interest in this topic and we really want to hear your questions. So please drop your questions in the chat as you think of them, or raise your hand and we can have you ask your question directly when the time comes. Great. So my first question is for Dr. Yamamoto. Dr. Yamamoto, you co-chaired a major effort by the National Academies to examine DEI and racism in STEM settings. So what were your major takeaways?
So thanks, Jessica. You are referring to a National Academies Summit, DEI and Anti-Racism in 21st Century STEM Organizations, held 2 or 3 months ago, and I co-chaired the planning committee with Gilda Barabino, who's president of Olin College and president-elect of the AAAS. Many of you know her. This 2-day event was the first stage of a major multi-component National Academies initiative in response to a request from Congresswoman Eddie Bernice Johnson, who is chair of the House Committee on Science, Space, and Technology. She asked the National Academies to define research and policy actions related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the systemic racial biases that disadvantage people from marginalized backgrounds in pursuit of STEM careers. The goals were ambitious, highlight how racism operates at different levels in STEM settings, recognize the effect of systemic racism on the careers of individuals historically underrepresented in the STEM workforce, identify policy strategies and practices for confronting systemic racism, and identify ways to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion in STEM settings. Very ambitious. There were, as I saw it, 5 major takeaways from this 2-day summit. First, historical backdrop. Racism and its sequelae, inequity, and injustice are foundational in this country, rooted in the colonization, expansion, and development that has occurred over 4 centuries. Consequently, racism is embedded in all elements of society, including educational policy and law, including STEM organizations. Second, diversity science reveals that implicit bias can be demonstrated even in those who disavow it, and that individuals tend to resist DEI efforts despite good intentions and well-meaning behaviors. In fact, individual implicit bias is very difficult to change. Nevertheless, we can learn to align values with intentions. We can learn to recognize bias and produce the right responses despite the persistence of bias. So organizational leaders should shift their focus from teaching about shift the focus to teaching about disparities and ways that organizations can enhance diversity, and that this may change individual patterns of behavior more readily than expecting to shift bias, implicit or explicit. Third, anti-bias trainings, policies, hiring tests, performance ratings, and grievances are not effective in general, in working in isolation at least, to combat discrimination. Fourth, real solutions require a holistic approach and coordinated changes, engagement through active recruitment and mentoring, interaction through cross-training and self-managed teams, and mechanisms for social accountability, such as diversity task forces or diversity managers. All of those institutionalized as formal practices apply to all employees and trainees. And finally, educational environments must welcome all student identities and recognize that diversity increases the quality and significance of research and innovation. That DEI is an engine for advancing STEM. So those are the big take-homes. The next step for the academies is that we will host an expert meeting in November to begin to define steps toward specific recommendations and their implementation. So that was the outcomes of the task force.
Wow, some really interesting findings there, resonate for sure, the resistance, the sort of what is and is not effective, and really looking forward to those next steps and the more concrete definition on it. So if, I'm sure we'll talk more about those types of steps, but I do want to get to everyone. So turning now to Dr. Nolton, let's talk about PCORI's recent national priorities. So you have a goal of increasing the number and diversity of people and communities who lead and partner in research. How does that impact research, and ultimately, how will it impact healthcare?
Sure. Thank you, Jessica, for that response. And thank you, Dr. Yamamoto, for framing this conversation so well. So our national priorities for health is central to everything that we do at PCORI. It helps sets up a framework for our research agenda and guides our funding decisions to help patients and those who care for them make informed decisions about their health. And increasing our diversity of investigators, research partners, and study participants is just a small piece of how PCORI is taking a unique approach to doing and funding research a little bit differently. It's important for us to develop strong relationships and build trust with historically marginalized communities. And we're still asking about how we do work with these communities to get them more involved and to trust science and what we're doing. And we want to ensure that what we're studying really matters to these communities. And so that's why it's really important. We think that engagement and trust are mutually reinforcing, in that if we are able to engage more research partners from diverse backgrounds and study participants, that's going to lead to more research that they trust, that they know is going to matter to them. And as they trust the work that we do more, they're also going to be engaged more as well. And so we want to ensure that the research that we're funding and that the work that we're doing is relevant and applicable to the communities that we're trying to serve. Our advisory panel on patient engagement, or the PEEP as we call it, recently instituted a set of DEI principles that help guide this work. And they are inclusion, equitable partnerships, trust or trustworthiness, and accountability. And these are the 4 principles that we sort of ground our organizational views on patient engagement and other stakeholder engagement. And I won't go into detail for all of those because I know we have a lot planned for today. But when we do this all well, I think we get to work with patient and other stakeholders on research questions that matter to them. And it's sort of that nothing about us without us mentality, where we are working with them, not to do research on communities, but with communities to identify issues that really matter to them and will help actually make a difference. So that's really, in addition to a commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, we are really also being committed to being culturally responsive to the community needs.
That's great. Trust in research is such a key issue in studying what matters most to the communities. So thank you for that, kind of getting us started. Dr. Rao, what are your company's major goals and how do you assess progress?
I think a lot has been discussed already, but for Bristol Myers Squibb, I think our people fuel our success, and that's our competitive advantage. And we are committed to creating the best experience to attract as well as retain talent, the very best people that we can get. And consistent with our mission, vision, and values, BMS believes that we have a unique responsibility to address any systemic racial and health disparities in underserved communities, which results in lesser access, quality of care. And currently, we are taking some really bold steps to accelerate and expand the health equity and the diversity and inclusion efforts. For that, we're looking at things in different ways. There are 4 main key areas that we're looking at. And, I don't know whether you guys know, but we just invested $150 million to address these key areas, which are like health disparity, clinical trial diversity, supplier diversity, and of course, workforce representation. The workforce representation is something which is very close to my heart, and it's of particular interest to me because I think the talent pipeline is extremely important for a company to thrive, to attract talent from underserved communities. For example, we recently did announcement that we're partnering with HBCU colleges so that we can broaden our pipeline to diverse individuals. We are also broadening our pipeline, looking at executive and mid-career levels to source this. And this could be from homegrown talent as well as talent from outside. We're trying to accelerate this development of mid-career talent with a focus mainly on retention. And we're closely tracking these commitments. And I want to make a point that we're in it for a long haul. This is not instant gratification that we did something, we're done, and we're done with it. We really want to maintain the momentum. We really want to grow. We want to make our workforce more diverse and inclusive, because I think when different perspectives come in from diverse backgrounds, the company becomes more innovative, it becomes more competitive, because every person has a unique talent and they have been, they grow up in different environments, they come from different cultures, and they bring unique perspectives. And I think we can't put a price on that. And that's what BMS is trying to harness right now, is to get this unique perspectives from different diverse and inclusive backgrounds so that we can become competitive. And at the end of the day, it's all about the patients. We want our patients to get life-saving medicines, and we can only do this if we are innovative. And to become innovative, we have to look at the diversity, because it brings in different perspectives, making us more competitive. So, we're doing quite a bit now, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what impact it's going to do in the future.
Great. I'd love to talk more after these initial questions about that idea of maintaining momentum, and to hear from everyone. It's very much a moment in history currently, but we do need to pay attention to maintaining that momentum and keeping it going into the future. So Dr. LaVeist, what are the intersections between workforce DEI, which we just talked about a bit, and health equity? Is there a cross-pollination between these efforts?
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. I think there is a cross-pollination. I think that I look at all of them as inextricably linked. So if we're going to improve the health of populations that are that have experienced less than optimal health outcomes, one way to do that is to increase and improve their economic status, right? So there are many different ways that we can impact the health of populations, not just through direct service, through medical services. So at the Tulane School of Public Health, what we decided to do was to look at the fact that the consumers of the knowledge that we generate are disproportionately Black and brown people, but the knowledge generators are not. And we think that as a result of that, we don't have the nuanced understanding of the communities and the cultures that people come from that I think would be enhanced by expanding the diversity of the public health workforce, both in terms of knowledge creators and people who are actually working operationally to implement public health interventions. So we've adopted as one of our primary objectives is to increase the diversity of the public health workforce. And we mean that in a very broad way. So it's not just increase the number of the diversity of our student body, although of course that is one of our objectives. But it's also, since Tulane University is the largest employer in the city of New Orleans, and in most cities and in many other parts of the country, the largest employer is the university. Universities are much more than just places that teach and create new knowledge, but we are employers. So we want to increase the diversity of our staff, increase the diversity of our faculty, and I think probably most importantly, institutionalize our procurement strategy so that we are ensuring that we are doing business with minority serving businesses. So one of the things that we did in my first year here was to work with the university's chief operating officer to establish a bank account for the university in one of the local Black-owned banks here in New Orleans. Bank that does disproportionately their mortgages and business loans in the under disadvantaged communities here. So this is another way that we can have an impact indirectly on the health of the community by helping to improve their economic fortunes. So I think if we take a comprehensive approach like this, this is the way that we impact population health, not only through the direct delivery of healthcare services, but also through indirect mechanisms as well.
Such an important point, how educational institutions like healthcare institutions are a major driver of the economy in many communities and have that huge role to play. So thank you. And then Dr. Sellers, could you speak to the challenge of developing meaningful metrics to gauge progress in the DEI arena?
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here today. I think as Dr. LaVeist just pointed out and our other panelists, oftentimes when we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's much more complicated than the ways in which we tend to measure it. When we get down to measuring it, we're usually just measuring diversity in terms of numbers in a particular position, and oftentimes it's staff, or at a university it might be students and faculty as the primary space. When in fact, to really get at and drive diversity, equity, and inclusion, and therefore to measure it as both a way to assess progress, but also as a motivator and a knowledge producer for new attitudes and strategies, it's important that we do a good job of actually defining what it is that we're attempting to accomplish. Oftentimes, we have a number of one-off programs that have as part of its goal at the beginning a vision statement of a lofty set of outcomes, a new change, without any real change strategy for how this particular effort is going to result in that change. And as a result, that effort, or that flowery vision statement becomes the metric by which the particular intervention is assessed, and not surprisingly ends up coming off as being something that has failed, that it hasn't delivered on its ROI. So we have to first start in measurement in all cases, in our ability to define that which we're attempting to measure, and to define within a strategy of how are we going to change the structure, how are we going to change the culture that we're attempting to do so. And to do so in ways that go beyond the D and really get to the tough part, which is the E and the I, particularly the I. When you start talking about inclusion, you're talking about changing power. That means different decision makers. That means changing not only who you are, but changing what you do, how you do it, and perhaps most importantly, for whom do you do it? And so as we think about measurement, I like to think of it as an important tool for change in and of itself by driving and forcing us to think more strategically, to set up timelines, plans, expectations that are realistic, that build on each other to lead to larger outcomes.
I love that notion that vision statements are not metrics and that it's key to define what you want to accomplish. So actually a question to everyone is, how have you defined what you're trying to accomplish in DEI? What is the most important thing that each of your organizations or sectors is trying to do to advance DEI? I'll open it up to whoever wants to get started, or I can call on folks.
Well, I can start, Jessica. For BMS, the most important is to sustain that culture of inclusion, right? And this culture of inclusion relies mainly on the diversity of people and the unique perspectives, as I mentioned, and the experience for us to achieve our patient-focused mission. Along those lines, what we have is something called the People and Business Resource Groups, which is called PBRGs. And this is a great way for us to commit to a truly distinct way that impacts our business performance. These groups specifically focus on DEI priorities, workforce, they foster a culture of inclusion. There's a strong employee engagement and, of course, higher levels of productivity because people feel welcomed, people feel their authentic self when they come to work. Because they're acceptable, and you get to learn about different diverse cultures within your environment, which just makes it richer. We're tracking the GDI strategy to ensure that we have the right investment and, of course, the intended impact. And one of the ways we do this is something called the My Voice survey, which goes to every employee globally. There's a lot of questions about how they feel about coming to work. Do they feel that they're their authentic selves? So we can really monitor, what the general consensus of employees are, what they feel about the company, what they feel about our mission, which is very, very patient focused. We're also looking at the impact of the commitments of the US clinical trial research sites, because, I told you clinical trials is one of the things that we're really working on in terms of engaging, physicians or from diverse cultures, as well as making it more patient focused. So, by 2022, we should know how this is sort of panning out. And this will, of course, result in a better science and better patient outcomes. To me, the biggest challenge right now, is the talent pipeline in sciences. For every job opportunity, the number of resumes that we get from historically excluded communities is limited. And I think the problem there is they haven't been exposed to science at an early stage. And that's where the whole STEM education sort of comes into the picture. So that's where we are actually investing a lot right now to, build this talent pipeline. Again, as I mentioned earlier, it's for the long haul. If we invest now, we're going to reap the benefits much later. So, that's what my company is doing.
You're referring to an early career internship program. Health Affairs actually is launching a fellowship program ourselves, kind of trying to get more people in the door. So it's a similar initiative on that.
It's very important. Yeah. So we just piloted an internship program, and this has been happening on the East Coast for quite some time, but I'm from the West Coast, and we just piloted one just this year, and it was a resounding success. And I can talk a little bit more about it later. I'll give my colleagues time to address this question.
Yeah. Just want to say, I think the pipeline issue is really critical, and universities have a key role that we can play. I'm going to just tell a quick story about this that I think is relevant here. I was recently visiting, I was doing a site visit at a university in California. It was University of California, Irvine. And we did a site visit there as they prepare to develop their School of Public Health. Coming across the campus, you see the diversity of that undergraduate student body is impressive. And so when we're in the meeting, I asked, well, why isn't your graduate student body and your faculty Why don't you have a larger, more diversity in your faculty and your graduate students? And the answer they gave me was that, well, it's a pipeline issue. And my reaction to that was that is a completely illegitimate response for this institution. If University of California, Irvine wants to increase the diversity of its faculty, all you've got to do is walk out into the courtyard and just randomly grab any number of these undergraduate students and say, come follow me, and in 6 years, you'll have a PhD and you'll be on our faculty. Universities are faculty and we are scientists factories. That's what we do. We produce these people. So to make the argument that the pipeline is a barrier, which is something that I hear very frequently from universities, I just think is totally illegitimate. We simply can create those pipelines very easily. And in the case of that institution, they simply had to go outside their front door and just collect those students. If we develop, if what we need is the will, the ability to do it, we know how to do it. We know how to train people. We can develop more people with PhDs in STEM fields. And we can do that in a matter of a short few years if we utilize the resources that we have at our disposal.
So I'd like to, oh, please go ahead. No. After you.
Well, I was just going to, first of all, completely agree with Tom. I think that this pipeline rationale comes up all the time for me as well. I was on the NIH task force on diversity in the biomedical workforce in 2012, and heard it in the committee as we began to look through data on the number of in the case of this particular discussion, African-American PhDs awarded in the United States, and the vanishingly small number that was there. I had the disturbing feeling that the committee was sort of relaxing and thinking, oh, this is not our problem. This is a K through 12 problem. This is a pipeline problem. There's nobody to train, nobody to hire, so we don't really have a problem. I find that to be really a disturbing rationale, excuse, as Tom does. And I'd like to address something that I think is related. Jessica, you asked about the most important thing that our organizations are doing to advance DEI, and I'd like to flip that and talk about what I think is the most important thing that we're failing to do to advance DEI. And in my mind, that is, the big barrier in my mind is this still pervasive assumption that diversity and research excellence are, yes, important high-level goals, but that they're essentially mutually exclusive, that there's a trade-off. If you're going to pay attention to diversity, then you're going to have to give a little in the excellence of your research. As long as that assumption, tacit or direct, persists, I think that real progress will be at its best too slow, And there really needs to be a broad recognition, actually an embrace of the quantitative evidence that's out there that women and racial and ethnic minority scientists innovate at higher rates than their majority colleagues. I'm thinking there are probably multiple studies that drive home this point, but I'm thinking of I think a really important paper by Hofstra, McFarlane, and their colleagues published in PNAS last year, entitled "The Diversity Innovation Paradox in Science," that really underscores quantitatively this evidence that women and racial minorities actually innovate at higher rates, and that innovation, of course, is the direct line to scientific leadership, to economic leadership, and we need to embrace that and see that is really a real thing. It's really what Dr. Rao said, that diversity drives innovation, and unless we begin to really recognize that and embrace it, that it's going to be hard for us to move forward.
So can I piggyback on again, I think Keith and Tom's point, that the issue with regards to diversity can't be framed in a way that suggests it's the morally right thing to do. It has to be framed in the context of it is just simply the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do for our science. It's the right thing to do for our arts. It's the right thing to do for just about everything that we actually care about, our economy, et cetera. In every other aspect of our life, we think about diversity as being a good thing.
Mhm.
So in science, you don't want everybody thinking exactly the same way. That's not how you lead to innovation. That's not how you lead to change. But yet the ways in which we open the doors, or at least the gates to access to higher education, to employment, et cetera, is actually looking for people that look just like the people that's already there. So when we start looking in graduate programs, we have a very narrow view of what excellence is. And that view of excellence is usually very much correlated with the backgrounds of the people that are making the decisions. And we know that those systems are right because it shows us. When you start thinking about it in terms of just a simple psychological perspective, I know that I'm good. And therefore, if I'm looking for somebody else, I'm looking for somebody else that's like me. And obviously race and gender and other characteristics are part of it, but it also gets played out in ways like, where'd you go to school? How do you talk? What is your style of writing? All things that aren't necessarily related to the outcome that we're trying to get, which are smart, dedicated, hardworking, committed folks with ideas, and particularly new ideas. But yet the processes that we use to select are already situated in ways that are designed to not create diversity, but to create very homogeneous outcomes. So we should not be surprised. So while Keith, the work that your committee has done and the larger conversation with regards to unconscious bias has played an outsized role in the work in DEI, what's more important, at least in my mind, is issues of systemic bias, systemic barriers. Because you could have someone who looks just like me engaging in exactly the same kind of behaviors and getting the exact same outcomes. And so we've got to change. And that gets back to that inclusion piece where we're willing to change it up. It's not enough to bring people in and have them do exactly what we want them to do. It's important for us to bring people in to change what we do.
Dr. Sellers, you brought a very, very good point. I think it's getting out of your comfort zone. You are comfortable with somebody who looks like you, talks like you, speaks like you, works like you, and thinks like you. We need to get out of that comfort zone because you exactly want somebody who is not you, because that is what is going to bring diversity to the table. And I completely agree with you, and that's what has to change. Not just at the university level, at the industry level, but even down to university, down to students, where you really want to harness that diversity aspect. And, as Dr. Yamamoto said, if you're looking for excellence and diversity are two different aspects, you can't combine the two together, but that's not the case, because somebody can be diverse enough and still be excellent in a very different way than the way you are. But that's what brings diversity in. So I think we have to keep that in mind. People go by labels sometimes, somebody's come from these Ivy League schools and the other Ivy League schools, which is great. They're smart, but there are equally smarter people in other schools which you can hire, which can bring a diverse perspective into your organization. I think it's extremely important.
And we have a question in the chat. The work of the University of Maryland, Baltimore County is legendary with respect to the cultivation of graduate and professional students from underrepresented groups. How how can that be replicated by many more institutions?
I guess I probably ought to take that one. I know UMBC pretty well. My wife and son are both graduates of that program, and I'm good friends with their president, Freeman Hrabowski. You know, I think that it can be replicated through leadership. I mean, basically, what Freeman Hrabowski created at UMBC was created because he had, first of all, he had the vision to do it. He was able to garner the resources that was necessary to do it. And he was in a leadership role and decided that this was going to be an important aspect of what this university does. And that's the kind of commitment that's required. And I think that's the other piece that's missing often. We talk about the increasing diversity in pipelines, but you need to also increase the diversity of people who are in positions to allocate resources, to make decisions about how the resources will be allocated, right? And so now as dean, I'm in a position where I have an opportunity now to make decisions a little bit differently than some of my other colleagues and counterparts at other institutions, which is why, you know, I think we've had the success that we've had with expanding the diversity of our faculty and student body. So it's really all about leadership, and what Freeman did can be replicated, I think, virtually anywhere, but you need someone who has the strategic skill that he had and also the will to do it.
Just a reminder to folks to put questions in the chat or the Q&A, and we will get to them.
Jessica, if I could just jump in and just add on to that point, that Meyerhoff program from Hrabowski at UMBC is 33 years old. It has demonstrated success from the beginning, and so to me, the kind of criminal thing is the root of your question, and that is that it hasn't been embraced and replicated all over the place as a recognized success, and it's just now beginning to happen. The Howard Hughes Medical Institute and the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative are putting in support at multiple institutions of different types around the country to replicate or to adapt to that program for that particular environment. And some institutions are also stepping up to resource programs of that sort. So that's a bright spot. It's great that it's beginning to happen. It's clearly doable, and I think it's just sort of criminal that it's been 33 years before we've really had an uptake. But at least it's going in the right direction.
And we've started talking a bit about challenges, sort of what institutions are failing to do. Continuing on along those lines, what challenges are you all encountering in moving these programs forward? What other challenges?
Well, there are some structural operational challenges. So one of the things that we have not yet figured out how to do is how to incorporate in the tenure and promotion process, how to incorporate the candidates' work in DEI space. So what we have is we've now added a requirement that the candidates for promotion and tenure at the university write a DEI statement talking about what they've been doing. But what we haven't yet fully fleshed out is so what do we do with that statement? How do we use that statement in a way that is going to be, effective, but not, and acknowledge the work that they're doing in the DEI space, but while not also penalizing faculty that are not involved in DEI as active in DEI space. So it's kind of figuring out how to calibrate that and get that quite right. We still have a little work to do there, I think. The other thing is incorporating it into our curriculum. We've done a review of our curriculum and determined that we are not addressing issues around equity and diversity and anti-racism adequately in our curriculum. And we're going to be reorganizing our curriculum to ensure that it becomes a part of our core required curriculum so that any graduate of our school will have to have satisfied those competencies. But what we don't have yet is enough instructors who feel competent to teach some of these topic areas. So these are areas, so we'll have to do some in-service learning and some development of our faculty there. And those are some challenges that I think is going to take a little time for us to fully work out.
I'll just jump in and say that I agree with so much of everything the panelists have already been saying. One thing that PCORI has been working on as a funder of healthcare research is that we're accounting for social determinants of health and how that relates or translates to the social determinants of participation in health research as well. And so we are working on understanding the reasons in which why people don't or choose not to or cannot participate in research, either as research partners, participants, or whatever the root causes are. And we're trying to identify those things and help address them and limit those barriers for people. We have done some work in identifying some best practices and overcoming those challenges and building and maintaining some partnerships. And I think a lot of the panelists have already talked about being intentional. And so we are recommending intentionality in everything that we do and our recruitment and retention of research partners, diverse research partners. We are encouraging compensation in everything that we do in engaging these partners. Investing time and energy to develop relationships. So I mentioned this earlier, is that we are really focusing on developing relationships and building that trust between these partners. We can't emphasize communication well enough as well. It's just a really important part of what we do. And training. Many of you have talked about the training of the workforce and building up researchers in STEM fields, and in our cases, healthcare researchers. And so PCORI has actually developed some research training for up and coming researchers who are looking to learn more about patient-centered outcomes research and comparative effectiveness research. And they're available for free on our website. We've made it that way so that there's not a barrier to entry to just even get the training. And hopefully that will help build their capacity and build their confidence also to participate in these research projects. So we're still working on identifying some additional challenges, but we think we've identified some and hopefully will help address them.
So one of the biggest challenges that I faced as a chief diversity officer at the University of Michigan, we have been engaged in a goal of long-term institutional change. So the University of Michigan has been around for 200 plus years. It was not founded on principles of diversity, equity, or inclusion. And so we are trying to change that 200-year culture. So not just programs, not just initiatives, but really to address three goals. I call it the people goal, where we want to be more diverse in access, as well as opportunity for advancement. Our process goal, we want to be to create a more equitable and inclusive community and culture where everyone has an opportunity for success. And then the third P is our products goal. We want to infuse the values and principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion in everything that we do, which means our scholarship, our teaching, our service, our business relationships, our political space. That's the ultimate goal of what we're attempting to do. And doing this in a long range fashion. The challenge is, on the one hand, is really living at two different levels. One level is the level of climate. The other level is the level of weather. So the more progress you make in terms of that long-term institutional change, it's going to have an impact on how people feel in the day-to-day. So the more you push, the more changes you make. It's not going to lead to a kumbaya moment. It's not going to be a smooth moment. In fact, you're going to find even more challenges, more pushback, more barriers, more nuanced issues than when you first started the situation. People begin to have higher expectations for the institution with regards to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and therefore are not as quote unquote satisfied or willing to be satisfied as they were before the process. And needless to say, the last few years in America have not been the easiest if you happen to be a member of a minoritized group. And so dealing with, at one level, change that I know is happening at an institutional level, but yet that change is not feeling the same in individuals' day-to-day experience. Just as from a global warming perspective, it may be the earth is getting warmer, but it may be colder outside. And you have to deal with both. You have to deal with the fact that the earth is getting warmer and have a strategy that moves at that level. But at the same point in time, you can't go outside when it's freezing and say, yeah, but the earth is getting warmer. You also have to find a way to live at both of those levels of reality. And sometimes those levels of reality also push and make it difficult for you to really hang in and make that long-term institutional change. So how do you be strategic without not pushing? How do you both push and be strategic?
So I understand we have a hand raised from Sophia. If we could unmute Sophia.
Hi. Thank you so much for this conversation on DEI. As a first-gen college student and first-gen Southeast Asian American who got my PhD and did a postdoc in the biomedical sciences, I really love hearing these discussions about improving DEI in the workplace. What I don't hear about is the necessary and concurrent discussions about why people are leaving the R&D pipeline. Working to reduce and eliminate discrimination and racism and enhancing diversity is phenomenal. But what about addressing other issues in the R&D pipeline, like long hours and low pay in academia, where people receive their training? What about harassment, mental health, power imbalances? I just feel like without fixing these issues outside of DEI, it'll be hard to evaluate the effectiveness of DEI changes in the pipeline and in the workplace.
Who wants to kick us off responding to that? Thank you, Sophia.
So I think part of that is I think all of that is a DEI issue. So sometimes the culture that results in threats to mental health are based on perceptions of, well, this is how it's always been done and that's the way it should be done. Or based on assumptions of course, I have the resources available to donate or to work all of these particular hours without worried about other kinds of responsibilities and challenges that I have. And so the model fits the quote unquote typical student, which is the typical student that represents the folks that are in charge and not necessarily representing all of our students. And that's the real challenge to DEI, is not the typical student member of the workforce, et cetera, but to try to create spaces, opportunities, processes, whether it's ways of learning, ways of teaching, ways of developing that fully captures the broad universe of ways of knowing, ways of learning, ways of getting work done, so that we're not trying to fit everybody in this exact same process because it worked for one group of folks who are on the other end without thinking about all the talent that was lost before getting through that pipeline.
Thank you for your question, Sophia. I agree with Dr. Sellers, and I just want to add that I think what you're highlighting is that this is really difficult work. It's complex work, and it's not going to happen overnight. And some of the things that we've been talking about are some of the lower hanging fruit, some of the things that we can are tangible things, but you're talking about like changing organizational culture and environment, which is definitely necessary as well, and just the harder part of the work. And I think Dr. Sellers talked about this is like the equity and inclusion part is the hard part. Diversity part is almost the easier part to measure. And also, others have talked about the intentionality of just hiring more or finding more students of diverse backgrounds. That's not the more difficult part of it. The culture change and the systemic issues that you're highlighting are spot on. And I think that those are the things that our courageous leaders and our leaders in our organizations and also in the environment around our organizations are responsible for creating. And so we have a responsibility to set that example and to start changing the culture of our organizations. And at PCORI, we're also looking at our policies and procedures, how we do business and how we do our work, not just the work that we do and who we work with. So it's a very holistic model of how we're thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and it's going to take some time. So as an organization, we've built some near-term goals and some longer-term goals, some things that we know are just going to take longer and are exactly what you're talking about changing those things in our organizational culture.
We have about 2 minutes left. There is one more question in the chat. Where can we look for best practices for recruiting, hiring, and retaining diverse faculty, and also changing or updating our curriculum? So maybe a quick response to that. I know it's a big question.
I was thinking Robert Sellers asked a question. Where to get the buses?
Well, I'm gonna throw a plug, a self, as in U of M serving plug. We have a wonderful program called the Collegiate Fellows Program that is designed to diversify our faculty in our College of Literature, Science, and Arts, where the focus is on individuals who have a demonstrated commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion through their scholarship, teaching, or service efforts. And that it's a program that provides faculty, or really encourages departments an opportunity to hire outstanding faculty. We work to bring in a strong pool of faculty. Each department then is given the groups of applications that are brought in, and then the departments are trained on how to look at issues of diversity statements and how their work would fit in within the department's work, scholarly work, et cetera. And then we select, the departments themselves select folks, and they compete for, in effect, free positions that they otherwise wouldn't get. And these free positions are taken from the regular pool of positions. So a department could choose not to participate, but it will have consequences down the line because there'll be fewer quote unquote pool positions. So they need to participate in this process. They're provided development opportunities, working as a cohort throughout the process, specifically focused around how to be a change agent at the university with your commitment to DEI. Also provide support as a oftentimes minoritized faculty member. So I would go on to diversity.umich.edu for that program, as well as several other programs that talk about ways to broaden the pool, to mitigate bias in the search process, and to develop and retain faculty with diverse backgrounds and perspectives.
Thank you. Well, thank you all so much for this really fascinating, stimulating discussion. I think with that, we are at time. And thanks again.